Thank you for joining us today to discuss competing narratives. What history will young Texans learn? And also a big thank you goes out to the Stewart Security Capital for its generous sponsorship of this event. For Generation Z, many of whom are incoming college freshmen, there are really two versions of American history. One is, the story that every nation is striving to become a more perfect union, like the United States. The other is a revisionist story of a nation built on slavery and oppression, kind of an irredeemable bastion of racism. So which view will actually prevail? And to answer that question today, we have Dr. Christopher Hammons with us, the director of the Morris Family Center for Law and Liberty and a professor of political science at Houston Baptist University. He teaches courses in constitutional history, political thought, and presidential politics. It's great to have you on today.
Thank you very much, Lucy.
Well, we'll just dive right in. And my first question is, obviously, as a professor, you deal with college kids every day. And so I want to learn a little bit more about Generation Z. What do they think about America? Are they cynical, patriotic, liberal, conservative? What does this college class look like?
Well, good. So for people who don't follow sort of demography or sociology, Gen Z is this generation that was born from about 1995 to about 2010. So at the older end, they'd be about 25 years old. At the young end, maybe 10 years old. I have two children that are part of this generation. My daughter's 20, my son is 15. And the freshman class that just started with us this year in college that I teach on Monday, Wednesday, Fridays, they're 18 years old, born in 2003. So they're smack right in the middle of that Gen Z sort of label. It is a generation that has a lot of things very admirable about them, a lot of things that we could be critical of. To focus on your question, I would say that their view of America ranges from unenthusiastically ambivalent. They just sort of feel like, America, what's so great about it? Or sort of righteously cynical, sort of the social justice warrior mentality, that they really have a sort of a disdainful look on America and what it stands for. And when you look at the generation, there's a lot that sort of lends itself to that worldview. I mean, if they're born in, let's say, 1995 and looking forward, look at the sort of the key events that have happened in their life. September 11th, which the 20th anniversary will be this Saturday. We'll talk about tomorrow in my freshman government class, because many of them were very young or not born yet and don't remember the event, right, and why it was so impactful. In 2008, we have the Great Recession. So many of this generation remember maybe family members losing jobs, might have been in a financial situation where their family lost a house or elder siblings had to be pulled out of college. We move forward to 2016, maybe the first election that some members of this generation could participate in, where they're told that the democratic process has failed, that the election was rigged by a foreign nation, that democracy doesn't work. Of course, then we have the huge pandemic, which shuts down the country. Many of them have to withdraw from school. They have to go online. Their social life is devastated. Their families have lost family businesses and family jobs. And maybe they have loved ones who have passed away. We have the George Floyd death, which for many of our young people is sort of an indicator of racial oppression and injustice in the country. And then in 2020, we have another election where the other side of the spectrum argues that democracy doesn't work, the outcome was rigged, and your vote doesn't matter. So there's a lot of young people here who look back on their lives and they don't get or understand what many people, maybe from my generation or older, why we feel so strongly and passionately about America as an exceptional nation. They just don't see it. And one of the things that kind of wounded me most in the class one time is at the end of the semester, sort of talking about what makes America an exceptional country in the annals of history. I asked the students the question on the last day. So why is America an exceptional nation? And this voice from the back, this one young man says from the top row, this sort of question I hear sometimes on social media, is it though? That sort of that phrasing and that tone. And it's not that he could push back. I said, what do you mean by that? And it's not that he had a good response, but there's this general skepticism that everything that they hear older generations talk about American exceptionalism, they just don't buy into it. It's sort of a foreign concept to them. And I think that part of what drives that sort of worldview is their reliance on social media. I mean, they're tied to their phones, my children too. It's a constant battle, right? And so their news and everything they see of the world and politics comes from social media. And the danger of social media, I think, is that it provides an audience for people who they could be completely wrong or their worldview is kind of crazy, but they have a platform to put those views forward. And so a young person, it used to be the case that if you had political views you wanted to share or develop, you would have to do this in a high school debating society or a political science class in college or with people around a coffee table. And you had to be prepared to defend your views, to revise your views if they got pushed back on, to have people challenge your facts, and sort of back down and realize that the person across from you is a human being and you might not disagree. And it's very humbling. Right? It takes a lot of courage to be able to voice your opinion in that way. But with this generation, you can post stuff online with nobody fact checking you, nobody pushing back, and in the anonymity of your home. And then you feel empowered to sort of put forth this position, and this becomes sort of your truth, what they say, my truth. This is my truth, my worldview, regardless of the basis in fact. So they begin to repeat the stuff they sort of hear, right? The sort of the challenge, this idea that America is an exceptional nation. Social media then also provides sort of a validation of those views, because you check and see how many of your friends liked your comments or how many thumbs up you got or smiley faces or hearts or whatever. And so you start to believe your own press, right? That my narrative of America as a failed experiment must be true because my friends are saying that's the case. Your friends might just be pushing this forward because they think they like you, they don't like what you say. And then lastly, because the algorithms, the way social media works, if you put something forward, you begin to get sort of links on all your social media feed that validate that particular worldview. So if I want to make the argument that that COVID is a function of alien bodies that crashed in Roswell, something completely wacky, and I put it on social media, I start getting articles from other people who sort of have the same views. So I say all that is that once that sort of narrative of America as a failed experiment goes out, it starts to be sort of reiterated to the students over and over again. And they get more of that than they do of the sort of foundational principles and freedoms that we take for granted in this country. And that's what they don't see. And I think that's part of youth. It's part of their the lack of education they get. And so they're being taught or learning and experiencing something maybe very different than previous generations did.
It's really interesting because I've experienced some of that myself. I was just watching a documentary about 9/11, speaking of, a few days ago, and I noticed something really interesting about it, which was the day after, the people gathered around the Capitol to sing God Bless America, and how patriotic of a generation that was, and put that in contrast with, we host some civics teachers every summer to give them some professional development, and we have teachers who come in and say they're already cynical about America in 8th grade. And so it starts really, really young. So that kind of brings me to my second question, which is, how do this generation that's cynical about America then view the role of government? Right. What is that responsibility in light of them looking back and thinking America is broken?
Yeah. So the very first question I asked in freshman government, which I teach every year, is what is the purpose of government, right? And there's usually dead silence because it's not a question that really young people typically sort of ponder, right, or delve deeply into. Across the board, the universal answer is the role of government is to help people, right? The role of government is to solve people's problems. The role of government is to make our lives better. And we can kind of make a list of all these things. Nobody ever says rarely does any student ever say the role of government is to protect our liberties, or to sort of stay out of our lives. So they have a natural tendency to sort of see an activist role for government in our lives. And I think there's a place for that, right? That the government can help people. But I think what concerns me is they don't delve very deeply into the implications of what that means. And so when I push a little harder and I said, well, why do you believe that government should help people? One of the responses will be, well, it's full of smart people, like experts that can help us. And I asked, well, if that's the case, then why do we even bother with elections? Right? Why not have sort of an aristocratic body of well-educated bureaucrats who are well-credentialed, who can simply make all these decisions for us if they know so much better than we do? And the students will kick it around and say, well, because we want to make sure the decisions they make reflect our values. So what that tells me is even smart people with credentials can have differences of opinion, right? And that sort of is something they haven't pondered before, that the people who have control over us, who make these decisions, you might not agree with what their conception of helping the people is. And so they haven't pushed very deeply on that idea that the government should help people. they have no conception of what it means financially for the government to help people in terms of what cost that entails, not just the cost of liberty, but the financial cost. I'm shocked every year when the students are flabbergasted to learn that the government has no money of its own, right? That taxes are the only source of revenue for the government. And once that becomes a realization, that answers a whole new level of questions in terms of what is the proper role of government in our lives. And this idea of private property and redistribution of wealth, because what's involved in government giving is government taking, right? Every dollar the government gives out to help people or to start a new program to help people involves taking it from people who have rightfully earned it. And so that's a moral question that needs to be addressed that most of our students haven't thought very closely about. And I think for people who push back a little bit and say, you know, is it right for the government to be as involved in people's lives or have all these social programs? The initial reaction from young people is, well, why would you oppose that? I mean, you're a hateful person. You're more concerned about the money than the people, helping people, without realizing there's an ethical question of redistribution of wealth as well. They have no conception of national debt. And I was looking over some of my old notes the other day. I've been at the university for about 22 years. When I started teaching and we talk about the national debt, there was concern about hitting $8 trillion, right? So we're pushing 30 trillion now. And I read an article in Forbes magazine that by the end of this decade, the estimations might be that we might hit $90 trillion. So the students have no conception as to what that means financially for the future of their country or their own well-being as well. They just think that the money supply is endless, right? The government just prints what it needs or has as much money of what it needs. And then lastly, they really have no conception of alternatives, right? Is there the possibility that we can help people, but we don't necessarily need to look to the government first as the solution? Are there free market alternatives, private sector alternatives who could do the job in helping people that we want to help, but do it more efficiently, do it better, do it cheaper, and get better results by necessarily defaulting to the government to do it? And one of the things I always find is an interesting reaction is when we talk about sort of private sector initiatives or things like charter schools, the students have this sort of moral hesitation that people can make a profit off of an enterprise and at the same time do public good. And they see them as sort of antithetical, that you can't do both. But what I challenge them on is if we can get better results and help more people and do it cheaper and save money while some enterprising person is still making a profit or a living, that to me is a win-win. But the students, I think, have been ingrained to see that somehow making money and helping people are inconsistent. So the default becomes, to address your question, the default becomes the government is the solution, right? That to solve all problems, the government is the solution. And my fear is they have no sort of conception moving forward. What does that mean for liberty in the long run? And one way I sort of want them to think about that is if you think of our founders hardly ever used the word freedom, like they always used the word liberty. And they always saw freedom as a dangerous thing. And so if we think of liberty as sort of like this sphere or this circle where you can do anything you want, that's kind of a dangerous place to live. So our founders think of ordered freedom as their understanding of liberty, right? We're going to agree to give certain things up. So we agree not to kill from one another. That's a little piece of freedom we carve out. We agree not to steal from one another. We carve that out. Every time you come up with a law, you carve away a little bit of that freedom, right? And so the sort of the amount of liberty that's left to us shrinks, and we have to decide what we're willing to give up. Some of the things can be silly. It could be like we decide not to drink out of plastic straws anymore because they're bad for the environment and turtles get them stuck up their nose. We've seen that video, right? But it's one less choice you have to make. Yeah. And the point being that every time we rely on the government to pass a regulation or make a law to help people, it's a little bit less liberty we have left going down the line, right? And that liberty is finite. You can give away so much that you can't sort of get it back. So that's something else I challenge them to think about when we look to the government. What are you willing to give up in order to help people? One of the funny analogies I've found that maybe they understand is if we wanted to provide free pizza to help people who can't afford pizza, what does government pizza look like? And are you willing to eat that for the rest of your life? And for some reason, that sticks with them. I don't know why, but maybe that sort of brings it home. But that's the idea. You're going to give something up if you move in that direction.
The image of bad cafeteria food.
Well, there you go.
Close
that's
to their hearts.
That's right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that brings us to discuss what is the role of colleges and, what's the role they play in shaping these individuals to have those founding principles and values instilled upon them. Obviously, I mean, people would be thrilled to hear the type of discussions you're having in your classroom, but that may not be happening around the rest of the country. So what is really the true role of higher education in that place?
Yeah. Very little is done nationally to sort of promote our nation's history and our nation's founding principles. There was a study done maybe 5 or 6 years ago by an organization called the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, I think, ACTA is the acronym. And they did a survey of colleges nationwide to see what they require in their core curriculum of students coming in. So this would be the Gen Z generation coming through. And what they found was only about 1 in 5 colleges in America requires a traditional American history class anymore. So the common American narrative that sort of used to start with the Pilgrims and move forward, or Jamestown and move forward, has died out. And what has happened in colleges mostly is they still have a history requirement, but the history has become very balkanized. You can take specialty histories in like women's history or African American history or Latino history, and those are all very important subjects, but they come at the expense of the sort of common narratives that students understand the history of their country and the principles on which their country was founded on. And so I think it's one of the reasons when students leave college or they enter college, they have no conception as to what the principles are that the country was founded on that make it unique, right? And that's why they have this sort of cynicism, or at least sort of an ambivalence about sort of the American experiment, because to them it's just no different than any other country. And they're not getting it in the education system. Yeah.
And I think that's too why you see a lot of energy around critical race theory starting to pop up. It started at the law schools, but now trickling down into other forms of higher education, especially the schools of education themselves. And so I'm assuming you see some of that similar type of ideology in students in support for critical race theory.
Yeah, so critical race theory is really an effort to replace the sort of narrative of the American experiment as a struggle for liberty, which really starts, I would argue, with the people who came here during the colonial period for religious freedom, the struggle for liberty during the Revolution against the British, the struggle for liberty and emancipation of slaves in the Civil War, the struggle for liberty and equality in the Civil Rights Movement. And critical race theory tries to replace that narrative of the struggle for liberty with the concept that America is really a country based on oppression and exploitation. And it really is sort of a reiteration or reinvigoration of an old Marxist sort of theology or ideology. And I don't say that to mean alarming, but what I mean that is that the Marxist view of world history is one of oppressors versus oppressed, right? And Marx says all of history can be shown as a struggle between those who have power and those who don't have power, those who have wealth and don't have wealth.
The dichotomies.
Yeah, that's right. The bourgeoisie and the proletariat, right? That tension. And so that sort of worldview of oppressor and oppressed, power and no power, is really at the heart of critical race theory. And I would contend that what has happened is that under that sort of Marxist theory, there was this belief by people who were adherents to communism and Marxism that the people who had nothing economically would rise up against the people who had everything. And the revolution would occur and the workers of the world would unite and create the workers' paradise. And all that failed in the late 20th century and in the early 20th century. And we see that in the old Soviet Union, which no longer exists, Venezuela, Cuba, China has sort of moved in a different direction, but the oppression that occurs there. And so these adherents to this worldview realize that class struggle is not the way forward for that ideology they advance. And so what they've done is they've taken the old sort of box and rewrapped it in a new wrapper. And the struggle is no longer between economic groups, but between racial groups. And there is a term or an acronym that I've heard increasingly in the past year or two that is called BIPOC. You've probably heard this. It stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. So sort of broad groups, BIPOC. And the struggle under the sort of the critical race theory is between the BIPOC group of people and people who are not BIPOC, which would be, I guess, white people, right? People not of color or Black or Indigenous. And to me, that's very dangerous. And it's dangerous for a couple of reasons. One is it assumes that all people who are in that BIPOC category are homogenous in their thinking and worldview, right? It assumes that all white people in other category are homogenous in their thinking and worldview. And unfortunately, I believe if you teach children who are of color or Black, Indigenous, that they are systemically oppressed, that they will never make it in the world because the system is built against them, and that their salvation or reliance depends on the government protecting them, you're creating a whole generation that's sort of destined to fail. And I have no doubt that these students who come to us who are cynical, and HBU is a very diverse campus. I think people think because we're a small faith-based institution, we're all homogenous and look like me. No, we look like the city of Houston. I mean, we're very diverse. We were years ago, I think, ranked as the 6th most diverse campus in the nation. But I see it when these students come in, our students of color who are sort of don't know if America is for them, or they think it's only for people who live in certain zip codes, who look like me and you, and that they are not going to get a fair chance at the American dream. And to me, that's the real downside of critical race theory. There are parts of our country's history that need to be discussed and addressed to figure out how we solve those problems going forward. But to tell a young person, you're not going to make it here because the country is against you, is really damaging, not only to that person, but the future of the nation as well.
Which is why it's so important for our educators to instill that sense of hope and the American dream from a very young age. Yeah. And I know your university plays a major role in that. Part of your mission is actually to train and equip teachers to articulate and defend those founding principles. Yeah. And so I'm wondering, how much of your student population is teachers? What are you doing to reach out to teachers to help that next generation be raised? Yeah, great question. We do a lot of not only in our classes, but all the extracurriculars for students on campus in terms of lecture series. We bring in speakers and that sort of thing. But one of the things I'm most proud of is for the past several years, we have hosted teacher workshops on our campus, and thanks to some generous support, have done them in Austin and in Dallas and San Antonio. Phenomenal. Yeah, and so we bring our scholars out so that the teachers can, it's very convenient for them. We take different topics related to sort of the American founding. We did workshops on the ideological origins of the Constitution, like where the founders get their ideas from. We did one last year on Marxism, like what is Marxist ideology look like, and how did it play out in the world? We are doing one this year on the Federalist Papers in the spring. And so we normally get a good group of teachers who come who often have questions, because if they're very young, they probably didn't get this in college, right? They took a lot of pedagogy classes, or the history they did take was very slanted or just absent. And then we get some teachers who have been in it for 30, 40 years who maybe have not looked at the material in a long time or feel like they've gotten a little rusty. And what we want to give them is a workshop that looks at primary sources, lays out historical facts and ideas. We have some debate and discussion at the end of the workshop, and give them materials that they can bring back to their students. And like all teachers, they're picking and drawing from a lot of different sources. If they like what we say, I hope they can incorporate more of that. We do get teachers who sometimes challenge what we teach, but our goal is to say, well, let me explain to you why we believe this to be correct, so that they can articulate that position to their students. Because particularly in the public schools, they have a commitment, and I think a good one, to teach both sides of history and arguments and argumentation. But we want to equip them to be able to make the arguments as to why the founding principles are important and why we believe America to be an exceptional nation in the annals of world history. So that's a big part of what we do. Yeah. That point counterpoint method is something we really emphasize here at the foundation. Is both sides are critical to understanding history. History doesn't ever occur through just one lens. There are multiple parties, often more than two. And so it's important to at least get the bare minimum of hearing both sides of the debate. And speaking of, I hear that there may be a new place on campus where some of these seminars or discussions might be held. Can you tell me a little bit about the building of the Replica of Independence Hall? Oh yeah, super excited. So this has been something that the university has been committed to for over a decade. We started the Center for Law and Liberty, I guess in about 2007, when we realized we were getting more students coming to us that had little understanding of their nation's history and no understanding of our nation's founding principles. So it started as curriculum development. How can we address that problem? And we realized that it was such an important part of what we were doing as a university
that we wanted to have a facility to sort of house our classes in history and political science and law and philosophy and economics and free market principles. And initially we thought, well, we could do this in sort of a room, right? And we had some sort of mock constitutional debates and debates over ratification in this sort of mock-up room. And we realized what the real vision and dream would be to have a facility look like that. And as we thought about what facility would really make a statement in terms of our commitment to teaching about the American founding, and Independence Hall was the go-to place. So we met with the curator in Philadelphia. We got the original blueprints. We will be building on our campus. It's under construction now. Okay. And so people can go to the hbu.edu website and look for the Morris Family Center for Law and Liberty. There's a camera with a live feed to show the construction. And it will be the only building that is as close to the real Independence Hall in Philadelphia as you can get anywhere in the world. And the historic assembly room where the Constitution was created, the Declaration was debated, will be as accurate as we can get it. We're even buying furniture from the same man who makes the furniture by hand for the one in Philadelphia. And the goal is that the facility will have 2 classroom buildings behind it. So we'll house all our classes there, but we'll bring students over to that historic assembly room to debate the big moments and ideas in American history. So you'll feel like you're sitting at Independence Hall during the debates over the Constitution or independence in that very room where Jefferson and Adams and Washington and those guys sat. So it'll add a sense of time and space to the mission of what we're trying to teach through our curriculum. And the other part of that we're very excited about, we can also do our teacher workshops there, right? But the other part of it is that we want this to be a field trip destination for school kids from all over the state of Texas, really. And Great. The state requires, thankfully, in 5th grade that we teach the American founding. Mm-hmm. We want to bring kids in, put them in little tricorn hats, little long coats, debate independence as to why we should remain with Britain or be free, and what does that freedom mean, debate ratification of the Constitution, and give them a sense of history and why it's important to their lives and their futures. And one of the things we reiterate is that these principles are important to you no matter where you're from, no matter what you look like, no matter where your parents are from. And this building is sort of an outward visible sign of the importance of those principles.
Well, thank you so much for talking about that. I know right now we're going to switch to a little bit of audience Q&A, and there's actually a question from someone who's a little bit in the middle of the road politically, and asks, why does it appear that these 2 views are opposed? That 1, America has always been striving to be a more perfect union, and 2, talking about racism. There seems like there should be a way to make these 2 views compatible.
Yeah, they're not incompatible. As a matter of fact, one of the things that's very important to understand is that the Declaration of Independence is a statement of aspirational principles, right? This is who we would like to be as a nation. And from the moment that those principles are crafted, there is debate among the Declaration Committee as to whether the principles are consistent with a nation that enslaves people, right? Mm-hmm. And so from the very beginning, this tension between enslavement and racism and our founding principles is there. It runs through the Civil War. Lincoln comes and speaks in front of the Independence Hall, which is why I love the building, and says everything he believes about abolition comes from the Declaration of Independence and things that were built in this building. Frederick Douglass comes shortly after him and speaks in front of Independence Hall and says, we're not holding the principles that were in that Declaration of Independence. When we get to the Civil Rights Movement and that beautiful letter from a Birmingham jail that I'm sure you read, Martin Luther King invokes the Declaration of Independence. So we're always striving to improve our country's relationships, to do better where we failed, and to address the problem of racism and slavery that started at the beginning. What the critical race theory proponents argue, however, is that we have to dismiss that struggle, that tension, and just accept the position that the country is inherently oppressive, inherently racist, and that those principles are hypocritical. Mm-hmm. The narrative that the belief that the founders were fighting for liberty and trying to move in that direction for the nation, the critical race theory proponents would argue, no, their goal was to keep people enslaved, to maintain their power position, to protect their wealth. And so it's not that the issue of racism and how to improve race relations, to eradicate racism, and our founding principles are incompatible. Those are part of the same discussion, right? And we have those in our classes all the time. And it's interesting and great to get the perspective of students from different backgrounds on that. But the belief that those principles are worth nothing, that's where I think the critical race theory people fail, right? And if I would argue, if anything, the incompatibility that the questioner asked about is coming from that side of the discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I always point people back to actually the first draft of the Declaration of
Yep.
Independence and the section where Jefferson, writes of the atrocities of the slave trade
Yep.
and how horrible it is that the king is imposing some of that on the colonies.
Right.
Obviously, there's blame to go around,
Yeah.
plenty of parties,
Mhm.
but there's also particular interest in the clause where he mentions this. He calls the slaves men, and he puts the word all in capital letters to make it plainly clear that related to the phrase all men are created equal, that those principles apply to everyone.
Yeah.
And while they may not have been upheld throughout our points in history, those are still kind of guiding North Stars that our country should look to for those values.
Yeah, I think that's true. And that thing I sometimes point out to my students is, slavery is a violation of all the principles of the American founding, which is why it's the great sin in American history, right? The idea that natural law, that we all have rights from God, we're all equal in the eyes of God. Slavery violates all that, which is why those principles are so important. So I tell my students, even if you have issues with, if you don't like Jefferson or whoever, that's fine, but the principles themselves are beautiful and unimpeachable, right? And they're worth upholding and discussing and defending. I point out to them that slavery had been part of human history since the beginning of time. It still exists in many parts of the world today in various forms. But during that American founding period, when that declaration is crafted, it's the first time in world history where someone steps forward and says, is this right? And so you have this crack and sort of this historical institution of oppression and slavery, where for the first time a people question, we can do better than this. And in the span of time, within 100 years, we have a civil war over the issue. 100 years later, we have a civil rights movement. So it's like we had this long, drag out use of slavery as an institution of oppressing people. And then for the first time, this crack in that institution, right? And it doesn't mean we can't do better going forward, but we have made great strides in the past 200 years to eradicate an institution that in many parts of the world still exists.
Well, we're getting close to our wrap up time here, but I want to ask one last question, which is kind of, what is the hope looking forward? What do you see occurring on college campuses, whether it's from the administration, the faculty, or the students themselves, that make you hopeful about the future of America?
Well, I'll tell you, one of the things I most admire about this generation is they are hungry to learn, right? And unfortunately, they go to the social media to learn. They'd be better off with primary text, right? And reading books. And that's a challenge. But what I've discovered is they are hungry to learn. They are hungry for a moral compass, right? And that's one of the reasons I think that anybody who speaks with sincerity, people like Bernie Sanders, AOC, are attractive because they see somebody who they say, this person is authentic, is the word they use, who believes what they believe. So if you can get advocates for the American founding, right? People who believe that these principles are worth preserving, that they speak to human dignity and integrity, that they make the world a better place, the students are open to listening to that, right? And they'll ask questions and they'll push back, but they're interested in learning, tell me why America is an exceptional nation, right? They're skeptical and they're sort of ambivalent, but they're open to learning about it. And so I always go into class hoping that maybe if I can't convince them, right, that at least they will understand where I'm coming from, that why these principles are important and matter, and not see their fellow countrymen as sort of the enemy, right? That we're all, as Jefferson says, we're all Republicans, Democrats, we're all red and blue, whatever. We all want the same thing. We want a better America. And I believe that our nation's founding principles move us in that direction. And that's what I want the students to understand.
Well, that makes me really hopeful for the future of America. I'm glad at least, they're inquisitive, and I hope that every student, especially that comes to HBU, has that similar type of mindset. So thank you so much for being on with us today, and we look forward at a future point, hopefully having you back.
Well, thank you, Lucy. I enjoyed being here.
Thanks.